Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look at the ceasefire deal that almost never happened. Let's get started. At the time that I'm recording this episode, the 3 female hostages have been let out of Gaza and are back with their families. And first of all, let me just say, Baruch Hashem, thank God they are finally back in Israeli hands and out of whatever the disgusting conditions they were in for the last 400 plus days. I was debating whether or not I wanted to do this topic, mainly because I already did a little bit of a ceasefire topic as a bonus episode last week, but obviously this is very important and it's been on everybody's mind. I know everyone's been sort of glued to their phones and TV screens over the last little while, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit emotionally exhausted from this past week, dealing with these ceasefire up and downs, and I know that that's exactly what Hamas wants. That's literally the psychological warfare they play. But in hopes of helping you all, the listeners of this podcast, have a better understanding of what's going on, what this means, how this may be the same or different from issues we've seen in the past, I figured it's my duty or responsibility to come on here and explain a few things and go over what's been going on since my last bonus episode. So bear with me. This is going to be a little bit all over the place maybe. I'm going to try my best to make sense out of this whole situation. As many of you listeners may have heard in my last bonus episode, we know and we already knew that Hamas was always going to play games with this ceasefire. It's not the first time it's happened. It's kind of par for the course. They try to take everything they can in a deal, make that deal, and then in the last minute, just to prove their power or their ability to play around and play games, or maybe even just to, again, do psychological warfare, they will push the envelope of what they are allowed to do under the ceasefire. So as part of the ceasefire, they were supposed to provide a list of the hostages and when they're going to be released, in what phase. Unfortunately, as of 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, they still hadn't provided that part of the deal. They were literally ignoring the deal. And it's, again, just a power play. It's just to show Israel, really? Do you want to break the ceasefire and have all of your people back in Israel and around the world be upset, have the international media that we control blame you for backing down on this deal that everybody's been waiting for? Are you really going to put up a fight? And right or wrong, Benjamin Netanyahu actually put out a statement saying, no, we are not having a ceasefire. We will wait until you give us this list, like you agreed to, and then we will have a deal. So Hamas tried to use their typical psychological games, and eventually the ceasefire did start. Now, one thing I want to say to everybody listening, and I did talk about it on our last podcast, a ceasefire deal means the temporary stop of fighting based on the negotiated terms. What you'll hear on the pro-Pali side, which I've already received a number of troll messages from people, is, haha, we win. Netanyahu said that we're not stopping until Hamas is dead, and now they're stopping, sending pictures of Hamas people on day one and Hamas people today, trying to pretend like this is the end of the war. Just to be clear, ceasefire is only for 1.5 months, assuming, and we'll get to it in a minute, that Hamas even lets it go that long. The war will likely start again. The IDF has not officially left Gaza. They've left certain areas in Gaza as part of the deal. This war is not over. But of course, it doesn't really matter for facts when you're talking about pro-Pali people on Instagram. I have to give these people credit because if you think about the PR they do on their social media, it is incredibly good. They convince so many people about a lot of really stupid things. If you look at this current situation completely zoomed in to just Gaza and just the issue of, are there still Hamas members alive? Then yes, they can claim a victory. But when you zoom out to this entire conflict, obviously we know Hamas has been completely ruined in Gaza. But even worse, we can change it to the real story here, which is not that Hamas forced Israel into a ceasefire, but that Hamas did such a horrible job of what they were hoping to do that Israel has completely ruined their plans. If we think since day one, Hezbollah has been completely destroyed and ruined and was forced to go into a ceasefire because they lost against Israel, leaving Hamas without any protection. They tried to bring Iran into the fight in order to protect them, and they lost and were humiliated to the point where now they are absolutely done with helping Hamas. They have no ability to help. And we cannot leave out Iran-backed Syria, who is totally fine until Hamas started a war, which then caused Hezbollah to no longer be able to support Syria, and then Syria falling. So we can thank Hamas for that failure too. So if we look at this in the real way, not the social media pally BS way, you can realize that Israel succeeded in completely dismantling Hamas and all of their different arms of the octopus. And the reason they went to ceasefire was not because they did so well and it's a win that they made Israel ceasefire, but they went into a ceasefire because they had no allies left that could actually help them. They were done and they were slowly being destroyed. So as much as the pro-Pally social media is trying really hard to spin this into a win, don't forget the bigger picture here. And as we know, pro-Pally people on Instagram don't exactly need intelligence, common sense, rational thinking. We've seen that before. That's no surprise. But it is really funny to see how many people are celebrating the victory, as they call it, of this situation. Ha, we got Israel to ceasefire, so therefore we win. Meanwhile, we haven't heard anything about a genocide. I mean, I'm no expert on genocide, although we have done podcasts on genocide in the past, and you should go listen to them. But I have never heard of a genocide stopping miraculously with a ceasefire. If only the Jews of World War II knew that. Maybe the Allies would have made a ceasefire and the genocide would have stopped. But the supposed genocide, and of course, don't forget all of the frozen dead babies in Gaza because it's so darn cold. Amazingly, the weather must have changed and people were eating just fine because we saw in the streets the handing out of candies, the traditional Arabic thing you do when you're celebrating. We saw everybody in t-shirts, short sleeve shirts in the frozen Gaza. And it's just amazing to me that to us, people who are watching the footage, it makes sense. This is all a lie. Clearly, it is not freezing and people are dying when they are wearing t-shirts. Clearly, there is not a lack of food and starvation when everybody looks well fed and are on the streets celebrating and partying. But to someone online, a pro-Pally supporter, apparently that's a little too hard to do the math in your head. There is a genocide happening that miraculously instantly stops when Hamas makes a deal. And one last point I want to make about the whole issue about no food in Gaza and people starving and all of that stuff. As part of the ceasefire deal, more trucks are going to be going into Gaza now than during the war, which is part of the supposed humanitarian aid. Firstly, I'd like to point out the fact that the issue was never the amount of trucks going in, as you heard in many of my previous podcasts. The goods that were getting in from Israel were sitting and going nowhere or being stolen by Hamas. And we're going to assume, of course, that Hamas is still going to steal much of the aid because they need it for their fighters to regroup for the eventual war that starts. But it will be really, really great for the UN to finally actually do their job, UNRWA to bring that aid to the people so they can show the only reason why people weren't eating in Gaza was because Israel wasn't giving them food. Now that Israel's done a ceasefire, look how much food they're getting. If you realize that UNRWA and Hamas were part of the starvation plan, you realize that they can actually turn that off instantly. Hamas has no more reason to pretend there's a genocide and a mass starvation and a famine going on. So therefore, they will actually do their jobs and send the food to the people who need it. With all of that said, we can assume that we might get at least a few weeks of calm. Only rocket fire from Yemen now. We'll see how that goes because they claim their rocket fire was only because there wasn't a ceasefire. We'll see if that actually is the case. So there might be calm on all fronts, thank goodness, for at least a little while. But as I said in my last podcast, if you've heard it, there will be a time where Hamas is going to regroup, rebuild, put down their IEDs, make sure that they get all the hostages to new areas so they can bunker down for a little while. And when they are ready, you will see them again, just like before, push the envelope. They are not allowed to attack. They are not allowed to shoot rockets. They are not allowed to cause any problems, so on and so on. At some point, they will push the envelope. We saw this in Lebanon, if you remember. The Lebanese Hezbollah group had a ceasefire, and we found them moving weapons, repositioning things, not leaving the area they were supposed to leave. And Israel continued to fight them. The ceasefire did hold, but it was iffy for a little bit. This is the same thing Hamas will do. They will push the envelope. We were supposed to do this. We will not do that. And we'll let Israel break the ceasefire. And Israel will eventually possibly react. And then, of course, Israel will be blamed in the media because why not? Israel's always blamed in the media. And then the war will start whenever Hamas wants it to start. They will be sure to not have to release the other hostages at whatever point they are in the ceasefire deal. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Let's hope this isn't the case. But we've seen it before. This ceasefire is only for Hamas as long as it takes them to regroup and get ready to fight again. They have zero intention of stopping this fight. And it's not even like a secret thing. They have literally gone out on mass media in Arabic, so they know that the English world, all of their useful idiots don't hear it. But in Arabic, you can hear the now leader of Hamas saying, essentially, we won, and we are going to continue to do this. This is not the end. We will do October 7th over and over, and that the ceasefire was just a temporary pause to get themselves back in order. So the fact that there is a phase 2 that's supposed to kick in a month and a half, where Israel is supposed to then pull out further, and there's supposed to be another group coming in order to govern, since Hamas is supposed to be gone. We don't really have the details on who is apparently going to come in and solve this problem. Evidence shows that the Palestinian Authority is trying to become that group. Don't get me wrong, you've heard our previous podcasts. They are as corrupt as anybody. But over the last few weeks, you've seen the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, cracking down like crazy on their own Hamas populations, finally actually doing raids and doing the security work that they were supposed to do this entire time. They've started to do it as a sign to the world, look, we can take care of Hamas. Put us in Gaza and let us deal with them. We can do it. And another sign that they are vying for that phase 2 leadership role in Gaza is the fact that they, for the first time in over 400 days since October 7th, said that they don't agree or support what Hamas did on October 7th. Up until now, they have supported it or just kept quiet about it, but they never really called out Hamas. Now they are calling out Hamas for the first time. And my opinion, probably a pretty safe bet, is they want to show the world, look, we're not like them. We're going to, at least lip service-wise, say we don't agree with them. So therefore, put us in charge. We're the responsible people. Let me remind you, the responsible people who are in their 20th year of a 4-year term. It will be difficult, to be fair, for the Palestinian Authority or frankly anybody to go into Gaza, because if you look at the pictures and videos from the streets of Gaza right now, all of the Hamas terrorists who were wearing plain clothes while they were fighting amazingly went and changed, got their nice little uniforms on, and are parading in the streets. Clearly they are not all gone. Not that we thought they were. Many of them are. But Hamas is still there. And it is not an accident that during the ceasefire they came out in full force to make sure that the people who would revolt against them know for a fact, we are still here, we are still in charge, we still have our weapons, don't get any ideas about trying to overthrow us. Kind of like what we're seeing in Syria, Lebanon, and even Iran following the failure of their attacks on Israel. And it doesn't help that they're now getting thousands of prisoners coming out of jails. These are people who planned and were leading various terror attacks, Hamas-aligned members. Clearly, that is only going to help their planning. Just as a reminder, Yahya Sinwar, the guy who ran October 7th, was let out of jail the last time. So not only does this embolden Hamas, but it gives them very old-fashioned guys from the old days of the Intifada to help out. And something that is really interesting that I didn't bring up, someone else did, and it was very brilliant, I saw it online, is the fact that it's interesting how for over about 400 plus days now, we've been hearing all about the supposed innocent prisoners known as quote-unquote hostages in Israeli jails. Since Hamas took Israeli hostages and the PR for the Hamas and the propaganda they put out with their useful idiots started calling their prisoners hostages and trying to paint them as innocent civilians, someone who just threw a rock, this little child is in prison, all these women who tried to stab someone. It's amazing to me that no one else has brought this up, and I give credit to the person online who did. When Hamas made a list of the prisoners that they wanted to bring out of Israeli jails, can you guess how many of them are women and children and babies that they claim are in Israeli jails? I don't think there's any of these people who are wrongly convicted, wrongly put into jail, short sentences for throwing rocks. Every single one that they asked for are mass murdering males. Heads of Hamas who masterminded terror attacks are being let out. Normally I would joke and say I expect more from the pro-Hamas movement to see this and go, well, where are all the innocent children you say that you care about? Why are they not getting out of jail? But obviously they are too stupid to even care, or they are so anti-Semitic that they are cool with letting out the male mass murderers and not the babies who are apparently in Israeli jails. That really boggles my mind, but I've stopped trying to understand the pro-Pally side because it literally makes no sense most of the time. But I do often hold a little bit of a higher standard for mass media. To be fair, they've been awful on this whole situation. But it is really interesting. I was noticing today as I was watching all the mainstream media about the hostage releases. So you have, let's say, for example, CNN, wall-to-wall coverage on releasing the hostages. Let's just be clear that they have not really talked about the hostages maybe since October 7th, October 8th. Maybe I'll give them like a week after October 7th they were talking about it. And then, of course, they moved to wall-to-wall Gaza coverage. Poor Palestinians, poor Gazans, blah, blah, blah. They have not talked about them, I would say, easily in like 300 plus days. And all of a sudden today, they seem to care about the hostages. You can easily see through the bullshit that they are pulling. Never talking about the hostages, and now they'll do it because it's good news. But what you never hear now on the news is about the Palestinian Arab terrorists being let out. What is amazing to me is we've had wall-to-wall coverage of the poor Palestinians, even so much as to say that the people in the Israeli jails are poor Palestinians who are innocent. They've even said that Israelis are raping people in jail, blah, blah, blah. And now we're getting these amazing freedom fighters out of jail. Why are we not having their family members on TV? Why are we not talking about their biography like we're talking about the poor Israeli girls, about where they came from, how they got captured? We have their families on showing pictures. Why are we not doing the same for the terrorists? Is it because CNN knows how bad it's going to look to give the biography of the terrorist being let out when they've spent literally the last 400 days talking about these poor, innocent Palestinian Arabs? How embarrassed they're going to be to say that this baby who is innocent is being traded for a terrorist who killed 23 people and has 23 life sentences? Even they can't spin that. Honestly, I feel like sickened watching this coverage from CNN and other organizations who have cared little about Israel or the Israeli people or the hostages, now pretending like they care 400 days later. I almost feel like telling them, get those names out of your mouth. You have no right to talk about these people and tell their beautiful stories and talk about how nice it is that they're home. You didn't do anything to help them or even talk about them before today. And in a show of the total useful idiotness of the Western useful idiots, I want to share with you something I saw online this week that I thought was laughable. Absolutely hilarious at how stupid it was. And that is coming from the UK, where we have heard for over 400 days crowds of masked people with their Pally flags screaming, "Ceasefire now, ceasefire now. Israel, make a ceasefire. Israel's terrible because they're not ceasefiring. There's a genocide," they say. And this week, after the ceasefire was announced, at those exact UK rallies, do you know what they're saying now? Are they saying thank you, Israel, for ceasefire? No, of course not. They literally are chanting, we don't want a ceasefire. Think about that for a second. For 400 days, they screamed they wanted a ceasefire now. And now that there is one, they are chanting, we don't want a ceasefire. How is that for logic? If that doesn't show you what they really want, which is the fact that they want Israel to be wrong in every situation for ceasefiring and for not ceasefiring, for doing a defensive war or not dying quickly enough. They just want to demonize Israel, and it shows. In the end, really, we don't know what's going to happen with this ceasefire. It's really still up in the air. Thank God we have 3 of our people back, and God willing, we'll get more, and they will be alive and safe. But what we also know is the fact that Hamas will, mark my words, push the envelope. They will continue to do things they are not allowed to do in the ceasefire. They will play psychological and physical games, and they have always played these games during a ceasefire. Remember, we're dealing with a terrorist organization that does not play by any rules. Israel is expected to live up to this ceasefire to the letter. Hamas is a terrorist organization. No one expects them to do anything. It would be like asking my dog to watch my food on the coffee table while I go and get something from the other room and expect it to be here when I get back. We can expect Hamas to just break the rules. That's what they do. But they have done it in a very clever way. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, how Hamas is set up like many terrorist groups in the Middle East, where they have the political wing and the military wing, where they pretend that there's somehow a difference between the two. Hamas, the political and military wing in Gaza, has officially made a ceasefire. Now, technically speaking, if a rocket comes out of Gaza, they get to pretend that was Palestinian Islamic Jihad who did that. It wasn't us. We didn't break the ceasefire. And if Israel wants to decide to respond in Gaza, then I guess they're breaking the deal, not us. If random people from the West Bank or Judea and Samaria who are aligned with Hamas start going out and doing terror attacks, stabbing attacks, shooting attacks, car ramming attacks, they're going to say, hey, look, this isn't us. We're in Gaza. We're ceasefired. All the while, they are secretly telling their people all over the West Bank, which, by the way, isn't secret. They've already said it. Go and do terrorist attacks against the Israelis, and we're going to wash our hands and say, we have nothing to do with this. It is a sick game that they can play. And if you could only imagine the Israeli government signing this ceasefire and then telling a bunch of their people, hey, by the way, secretly, why don't you go into Gaza and start shooting and killing people? And we'll pretend that you're just a bunch of crazies and it has nothing to do with us. Not only would this never happen, but this would never fly in the international world, who of course would blame Israel and its government for any actions taken by any Israeli. And this would be cause for breaking the ceasefire. But for some reason, we pretend that Hamas isn't controlling all of their supporters all over the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Hopefully this episode has given you a little bit of info on what's been going on over the last little while. I know it's very confusing. I know it's incredibly emotionally draining for many of you. As I say to one of our biggest followers who I talk to on a daily basis and listens to this podcast every week, we Jewish people, sadly, are used to this. Some of you who only kind of got engaged on October 7th and after that aren't prepared for this type of emotional, psychological torture that we are constantly being put through. So if you need to tune out, understand that no matter what happens, this is always in God's hands. If you believe in a higher power, whatever is meant to be will be. You stressing about it and watching endless TV, going on social media and doom scrolling about all the terrorists and how happy they are, it's not going to help. It's not going to support your mental health. Do what's best for yourself and make sure that you are taking care of yourself. I'll end this podcast with a very interesting quote that someone else had posted, and I just want to reshare. This is from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 61. The prophet Isaiah says to the Jewish people, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings unto the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, and opening the eyes of those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's good pleasure, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn." This isn't the first time the Jewish people have struggled through issues like this, but we always stick together and we will always make it through. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.